Hello, higher historians, and welcome to your next issue, which is issue number 6, our last issue in the Cold War topic, an evaluation of the reasons for the end of the Cold War. So this is the last issue that we'll be looking at, and in this issue we're looking at the reasons why the Cold War comes to an end. So issue 6, an evaluation of the reasons why the Cold War ended. Now the factors which we'll be looking at in this section. So factor number 1, we're going to think about the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and why that was important in the Cold War coming to an end. We'll look at the failure of communism in Eastern Europe. We'll look at economic differences between East and West. We'll look at the role of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union near the end of the Cold War, and we'll look at the role of Ronald Reagan, who was the leader of the USA near the end of the Cold War as well. Now, this question is usually an isolated factor question, so that means there'll be one of these factors will be named in the question. So in your jotters, or if you're typing this up, if you want to note down the 5 factors which you'll be looking at. Now, the presidents and Soviet leaders involved in this issue, so issue number 6. We've got Ronald Reagan here, who features heavily, and although there is 2 Soviet leaders, Andropov and Chernenko, we focus on Mikhail Gorbachev, in particular on his role in the end of the Cold War. Now, some past paper questions just to show you questions that can be asked on this. As I said, it will be an isolated factor question. So to what extent did the actions of President Reagan lead to the end of the Cold War? The economic weakness of the Soviet Union led to the end of the Cold War. How valid is this view? How important was the role of Gorbachev in the end of the Cold War? To what extent was the Western economic strength the main reason for the end of the Cold War? Okay, so our timeline. So this issue covers a period from about 1979 to the end of the Cold War, which is around about 1989 to 1990. Okay, so that's the time period that we're looking at. Obviously, just before or just after 1979, we've got Ronald Reagan there being elected. You can see there that when Brezhnev dies, he's replaced by Andropov, and Andropov dies 3 years later, and he's replaced by Chernenko. Chernenko dies just a year after that. So we go through quite a lot of Soviet leaders in quick succession. Then we have Mikhail Gorbachev, who comes to power as well. Okay, so the first factor that we're looking at is the defeat of the USSR in Afghanistan. So you want to take a new heading in your jotter, which is the defeat of the USSR in Afghanistan. And what we're going to look to do in this part of the lesson is look at the USSR's defeat in Afghanistan. So by the end of the lesson, all you're looking to do is to be able to describe what happened in Afghanistan and write a draft paragraph on this in your jotter. Now, to start with, background to the Soviet war with Afghanistan. So who was involved, what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, and why did it happen? Now, Afghanistan hit the world headlines in 1979. Now, Afghanistan seemed to perfectly summarise what was happening in the Cold War. Now, from the West point of view, incidents like places in Berlin, Korea, Hungary and Cuba had all shown the way that communism was to proceed. And Afghanistan, in their view, was just a continuation of this. Now, if you want to collect this map, a copy of this map from your teacher, then you'll be able to add just some information about Afghanistan around your map here. This is just to give you an introduction to what Afghanistan is like as a country. So here it is here in red. So Afghanistan, so it's a country in the Middle East. It has rich oil supplies and Britain has fought many wars with them. It used to be one country with Iran but granted independence in 1709. It used to have a monarch but was overthrown in 1973. It neighbours Iran, Pakistan and Turkmenistan. It used to be Buddhist but is now predominantly Muslim. And they used to be very, very famous for their fearsome warriors. So that is Afghanistan there. So you want to pause the video at this point just to add in some notes around your map about Afghanistan itself. Now here's just another map here to show you where Afghanistan actually is in the world. So actually not that far from the Soviet Union. Now the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So what you're looking to do here is to use your handout, which again you'll be given by your teacher, to take brief notes on the Afghan war. So you're looking to pay close attention to who was involved, when did it happen, where, what happened and why did it happen. And these points will help to make up your KU points. So you want to use this part of your handout to take brief notes on that. Now, what you'd have filled in, so who was involved in the Afghan war? So we've got here the pro-Soviet government of Amin were fighting against a Muslim group known as the Mujahideen. Now Russia supported Amin's government but replaced him with a more suitable communist leader who was called Babrak Kemal. Now the Russian Red Army along with Kemal's government forces joined to fight against the Mujahideen. So when this happened, so December 1979 Russia invades and February 1989 Russia withdraws. Where is Afghanistan on Russia's southern borders? What happened? So in this war we have 1 million Afghans are killed, 20,000 Red Army soldiers died. The war cost the Russians around about roughly 10 billion a year. The Mujahideen proved to be a formidable opponent. They were equipped with old rifles but had a knowledge of the mountains around Kabul and the weather conditions that would be encountered there. The Russians resorted to using napalm, similar to what the Americans did in Vietnam, and helicopter gunships against the Mujahideen. And as you can see there, but they experienced exactly the same military scenario the Americans had done in Vietnam. So the Afghanistan war is almost seen as the Soviets' Vietnam War, if that makes sense. Why this happened? So Russia invaded to protect a pro-Soviet government to make sure that the Mujahideen did not take control and start to spread Islamic fundamentalism around Russia's southern sphere of influence. Now, after 1981, when Reagan became president in the USA, more aid was being sent to the Mujahideen, and Russia feared that the more the US would get involved, then this would threaten communism in that area. Now you can see here, this is an image of President Ronald Reagan here meeting leaders of the Mujahideen in the White House. This here is an image of Osama bin Laden, who obviously we know was heavily involved in the 9/11 attacks on America, but he was actually a member of the Mujahideen that fought against the Soviet Union. So quite ironic that America funded Osama bin Laden for a while. This here shows you the Mujahideen with a captured Soviet tank as well during the Afghan war. And this is another image here of the Mujahideen. Here you have the Russian Red Army going into Afghanistan as well. So, what you're looking to do next, think about what we just discussed there. You're looking to use your notes to write a draft paragraph. So use your handout to write a draft paragraph on the defeat of the USSR in Afghanistan. So you should be able to describe what happened here, and you're looking to think about why this led to the Soviet Union withdrawing and ultimately the Cold War coming to an end. Main argument here would be the fact that obviously it's a very, very costly war. The Soviet Union can't afford to keep fighting it, so this is a reason that they withdraw from Afghanistan and that the Cold War needs to come to an end. Okay, so factor number 2 is the failure of communism in Eastern Europe. So what we're looking to do in this part of the lesson is look at our next factor, which is the failure of communism in Eastern Europe. So what you're looking to do by the end of this part of the lesson is to describe why communism failed in Eastern Europe and write a draft paragraph on this in your jotters. Now, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Now, this is how the map of Eastern Europe looked in 1989. Now, over the next 3 years, the influence of the Soviet Union, as you see USSR there, was ultimately about to waver, and the rule of communist governments throughout the region was about to disappear as well. Now, Matt, what we're going to do here, again, you'll get this copy from your teacher. You've got here the failure of communism in Eastern Europe. Now, you've got here Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and you've got, pointing to the USSR there, policies of glasnost and perestroika, which were introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev. So you're going to look to use your handout here and the videos that will be shown by your teacher as well to fill in this map here. So under Germany, you're looking to explain why communism fails in Germany. Under Czechoslovakia, why communism fails here. Under Poland, why communism fails here. Glasnost. Glasnost effectively is a policy of openness in the Soviet Union, so people being allowed a bit more freedom in terms of speech and to criticise communism, which Gorbachev allows. That's a policy that he introduces. So think about how that leads to communism failing in Eastern Europe. And perestroika. So this is all about the Soviet economy being restructured so that it can make trade deals with Western countries and not try and be just self-sufficient in the Soviet Union itself. So again, that opens up a communist government to work with other governments as well. Okay, so the failure of communism in Eastern Europe. Now, at the same time as events in Afghanistan were showing the limits of the Soviet military power, new political forces were also stirring in Eastern Europe. Now, there had been economic development in Soviet-controlled East, but this economic development had been dominated by the need to develop heavy industry and military technology. However, this failed to happen, but it did happen in the West. Now, at the same time, the Western nations made sure that the Eastern population knew all about the progress that they were making in the West, but the East wasn't making the same progress. Now, by the early 1980s, most of the Eastern Europe economies were barely expanding, and this caused a lot of problems for the Soviet Union. Now, you can see here the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. There's a short video for you to watch here which gives a bit more detail about communism failing in Eastern Europe, and you'll be able to add notes around your map that you've been given for this as well. You've got here Solidarity in the fall of communism in Poland. Now, Solidarity was a trade union movement which expanded and became a political party. Solidarity also is against communism. So again, you've got a YouTube video to watch here, and this will help you in terms of taking notes for KU analysis under your Poland part of your mind map. And you've got here perestroika and glasnost, so you've got a YouTube link to this as well, just to let you find out a bit more about what perestroika and glasnost actually meant and what it meant for the whole of Eastern Europe. Okay, now once you've filled in your map and you're happy with how communism has failed in Eastern Europe, what you're looking to do is to use this handout here. This tells you a bit more about how communism failed in Eastern Europe, so you've got more notes here if you want to add any more around your map. Then you're looking to use the handout there to write a draft paragraph for this part of why the Cold War ended. Ultimately, if you think about it, the fact that the Soviet Union had all these countries under its control, and the fact that one by one one, they start to leave and move away from communism, then ultimately the Soviet sphere of influence is decreasing, and ultimately that brings the Cold War to an end as well. Okay, what we're looking at next, our next factor is West versus East, so economies in the 1980s. Now what we're going to do in this part of the lesson is to think about the economies of the East and West in the 1980s. So by the end of the lesson, what you should be able to do is to explain the state of both East and West economies in the 1980s and write a draft paragraph on this in your jotter as well. So differences between capitalism and socialism, so capitalism and communism ultimately. So this thinks a bit more here, this gives you an idea in terms of the differences between capitalism and communism. Now ultimately, the main point to remember here is there is two different systems in terms of their economy here. Ultimately, under capitalism, the economy is different compared to communism. Now the Soviet economy in the 1980s, it was at breaking point by the late 1980s. It's very important to remember that. Now since the 1950s, most of the countries of Eastern Europe had concentrated their resources on heavy industry rather than consumer goods. Now as a result, things like food, clothing and housing were in short supply in the East. Now management had become a privileged group with very little concern for innovation. Now by the 1980s, technology used in the region was rapidly out of date. The USSR was very slow to develop new technology like computers, for example. Commitments to the arms race as well, so remember the Soviet Union spending massive amounts on the arms race meant that the Soviet economy was very unbalanced. And the propping up of allied regimes, so propping up in terms of places like Poland, in terms of Germany, this was causing a big drain on resources in the Soviet Union as well. Now this image here just shows you a Soviet Russia 1980s grocery store. Now you can see here the queue outside the grocery store. Ultimately, there's a big food shortages in the USSR of basic necessities. This image here gives you a good idea in terms of West versus East Germany, capitalism versus socialism. So you could see also in orange West Germany thinking about per capita GDP. So how from the 1950s onwards it's constantly growing, but outgrowing the East German side, which is under communism. So ultimately, this was showing the superiority of the capitalist economy as opposed to communism. Now, Western economic strength. Now, America was in a very strong position. This allowed America to embark on things like the Star Wars weapons program that ultimately Reagan announced to try and basically get lasers to shoot down missiles from space. There was the perception that the West was very affluent through television, through consumer goods, and this undermined claims by the communists that their economic system was better. Now, throughout the Cold War, ultimately Western powers were flourishing under capitalism, and this allowed them to put money into weaker countries to turn them away from communism, and it also meant they could produce more weaponry and beat the Soviet Union in the arms race. The USA also had a lot of trade deals with other countries, whereas the USSR would have to improve relations with other countries and try and increase cooperation to get deals done. Now this just gives you a link here to the US government propaganda film Star Wars program, which just lets you see what they were trying to produce. And this here gives you a link to consumerism in America in the 1980s to let you see ultimately what consumerism was like. Now, think about limitation here, why maybe the economic strength isn't as important to the Cold War coming to an end. You could argue on the other hand that Soviet economic weakness was not the pivotal reason for the end of the Cold War, because the Soviet economy had been inadequate throughout the Cold War. Poland and Hungary had rebelled against the Soviet Union in 1956 because of poor housing and low wages, but ultimately the Soviet Union had been able to effectively deal with this situation. So ultimately it could be argued that maybe it's a more influential factor because the Soviet economy had been weak, you could argue, throughout the Cold War. It wasn't just near the end of the Cold War. Now what you're looking to do is to use your worksheet here to complete the activities on your worksheet and to write a draft paragraph in your jotter about why the economic differences of the West and the East bring the Cold War to an end. Okay, our next factor that we're thinking about is the role of Mikhail Gorbachev. What we're looking to do in this part of the lesson is to look at the role of Mikhail Gorbachev and think about how he helped to end the Cold War, and again to write a draft paragraph on this in our jotter. So the role of Mikhail Gorbachev. Now the USSR needed a younger leader compared to the previous three who had died from old age or illness. Now in 1985, Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Now he realised that communism had to change to survive, and that meant that he had to revitalise communism and give the people of Eastern Europe higher living standards. Now he saw that the USSR could not afford a new arms race, so he implemented policies of perestroika and glasnost, which aimed to reform the Soviet economy and liberalise its political system. Now he worked also to improve relations with the USA, so he took ideology out of foreign policy. So ultimately he was willing to work together with the USA to get deals done. Now, Gorbachev also told leaders of the satellite East European states in March 1989 that the Soviet army would no longer help them stay in power. So he was effectively allowing eastern states to leave the Soviet Union. Now, this is just two links here to videos about Mikhail Gorbachev. It's very important to remember the role of Gorbachev here. Even Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister at the time, she said about Gorbachev that he's definitely a man that we could do business with. So he was seen to be very different compared to other Soviet leaders. Now, what you're thinking about is how did Gorbachev end the Cold War? So this image here of Gorbachev, your teacher will give you a copy of this just to go into your jotter. Think about limitation, why Gorbachev maybe isn't as important to the Cold War ending. A historian, Joseph Nye, he's got an argument that the Cold War would have ended even without Gorbachev. So indeed, the Soviet economy was already struggling when Stalin ruled the USSR. Ultimately, when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, there's 50,000 personal computers in the Soviet Union compared to 30 million in the United States. So therefore suggesting that no matter what leader came to power, ultimately the Soviet Union would have had to call an end to the Cold War. So what you're looking to do is to use just this worksheet here to write a draft paragraph, and it says here in the activities collect a picture of Gorbachev to go into your jotter and note down the actions that Gorbachev took and how these helped to bring the Cold War to an end. So you've got here, how did he help end the Cold War? So you can use your handout here to help you to add notes around your picture of Gorbachev, then to write a paragraph on why ultimately Gorbachev helped to end the Cold War. Our very last factor that we're looking at in terms of the Cold War coming to an end is Ronald Reagan. So we're looking at how the role of Ronald Reagan leads to the end of the Cold War, and again looking to write a draft paragraph on this in our job. So the role of Ronald Reagan. So in 1980, the Republican candidate Reagan beat Jimmy Carter in the election. Now in 1981, Reagan became the 40th president of the US and also his oldest president. Now he was very right-wing, fiercely anti-communist, and saw the Cold War in ideological terms. He introduced something known as the Reagan Doctrine to ultimately keep countries away from communism. And he also increased the production of oil in the USA, which is very, very important because oil was a major export for the Soviet Union at this time. So by the USA producing more oil, that meant that there was a lot of supply in the world, so that obviously meant that the price was able to come down of oil, and that would obviously affect the USSR economically. Unlike many in the US administration, Reagan actively sought to challenge Soviet weakness and strengthen the West in order to defeat communism. In 1983, he denounced the Soviet Union as an evil empire. His program of improving US armed forces, including nuclear weapons, and his proposed Star Wars program looked to challenge the belief in mutually assured destruction as well. And he was very, very charming when he met Gorbachev and visited the Soviet Union. He was also a former actor, Ronald Reagan, so he was very charming when he spoke to Gorbachev as well. So again, you're thinking about how the role of Reagan helped to end the Cold War, so you should get this image again from your teacher to glue into your jotter. Why the role of Ronald Reagan may not be as important? You could argue that Reagan was not the most important factor, as his decision to create the Star Wars program could have furthered the Cold War. So although he looked to take a more aggressive stance, this could have actually increased tension. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited missile defences to one location per country at 100 missiles each, would have been violated by the Star Wars program had it went ahead. So again, what you're looking to do here is to use your worksheet to write a draft paragraph as well. So you'll see here in the activities again, collect a picture of Reagan to go into your jotter, note down the actions that Reagan took and how these helped to end the Cold War. Again, think about analysis plus why he wasn't as important in the Cold War coming to an end. And again, use that structure there to help you to write a paragraph on why the role of Reagan helped to end the Cold War. Once you've finished looking at the role of Reagan, that is you finished looking at all the factors in terms of why the Cold War came to an end, and we'll then move on to look at the essay next. Any issues at all, please just let your teacher know. Thank you very much.